Okay, my presentation is called Even Infirmities May Serve the Mode, the American Fashion Media's Response to Pandemic, 1918 and 2020. And what really got me interested in this topic was I saw a bunch of actually false images about what people were wearing in 1918 and what the fashion media was reporting about, because there was some miscommunication about what year it was. There were a lot of images of the 1930s and of like 1910, 1911. So I got really interested to see what was being done and what was there. Between the First World War and the Roaring '20s, the 1918 influenza pandemic has disappeared from American history. Historians have characterized it as one of the great forgotten episodes of American history, even though as many as 1/3 of humans around the globe, and over 1/4 of Americans, have been estimated to have been infected by influenza between 1918 and 1920. However, the rise of COVID-19 has reignited interest in this period of history as a possible point of comparison with the present crisis. Looking back at how the American fashion media responded to the pandemic over a century ago allows us to draw parallels and perhaps imagine what might happen next. This slide is a bunch of images of Women's Wear Daily headlines from 1918 to 1919, demonstrating the upset and furor caused by the pandemic and the worries about the industry, both from a health perspective and from an economic perspective. While this is an area that could merit much greater study, this short presentation will focus on several interesting similarities and differences between the fashion industry's response to pandemic in 1918 and in 2020. I focused on legacy media, specifically Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Women's Wear Daily, and the New York Times, which were all significant sources of fashion news in 1918 as they are today. Examining responses to the 1918 influenza pandemic in American fashion media reveals a distinct bifurcation. While the fashion business press covered the spread and severity of the pandemic closely, the consumer fashion press barely mentioned it, predominantly treating the disease as a mild inconvenience or a fashionable trend. Although it could be hypothesized the lack of attention paid to the pandemic by fashion magazines aimed at elite audiences could be attributable to a socioeconomic divide in the victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic, epidemiological studies have shown that in 1918, rich and poor were equally affected. The first area that I thought worth examining was the wearing of masks and veils. Today, this is one of the most visible signs of the pandemic, with mask trends quickly taking hold across areas affected by the pandemic. Looking at Women's Wear Daily shows that there was a similar move by retailers to create masks or veils for women that would be both protective and fashionable. Here we can see on the far left an image by Seattle photographer Max Luden that features women wearing the medical face mask around. The center image shows Women's Wear Daily advertising a medicated veil. Apparently Dr. Bruce knew how to prevent influenza. And on the right, face masks, the new global trend, which is from Women's Wear Daily from June 4th, so quite recently. Although the Seattle Daily Times reported on the wearing of fashionable veils to ward off flu in 1918, neither Vogue nor Harper's Bazaar make any mention of either masks or veils as a particularly stylish or notable trend during the duration of the pandemic from 1918 to 1920. Women's Wear Daily held on to hope that the increase in sales of veilings, which is what they called the category that included veils and masks, and ironically mourning attire, would offer a small silver lining to the woes of the industry. In November 1918, the New York Times reported on an increase in sales of veilings, including for Christmas gifts, suggesting that consumers did attempt to wear prophylactic headwear. However, there was not widespread agreement on the efficacy of veils versus masks. Only a month earlier, in October 1918, an editorial in the Times described veils as, quote, useless at best, and speculated that they might, quote, become distributors of germs instead of traps for them. On this page, I looked at a more fashionable approach to masks as opposed to a purely medical one. Here is an article from Women's Wear Daily showing the safety first veil. The second image is of another hat veil combo that came out from the same period. And then of course we have the off-white face mask. Research into fashion's response to the 1918 pandemic also reveals the way that fears around disease appear to coalesce around existing prejudices. For example, we have seen a rise in xenophobic and anti-Asian prejudice in response to COVID-19 as the public and some government officials have looked for scapegoats. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, articles and letters in the New York Times and Baltimore Sun referred to the idea that women's fashion, specifically sheer silk stockings and furs, respectively, either caused or exacerbated the flu, apportioning blame along misogynistic lines with the supposed vanity of fashion as an easy target. However, in the New York Times in December 1919, Health Commissioner Dr. Royal S. Copeland contradicted the idea that it was women's thin stockings that were responsible for the severity of influenza, reportedly responding to theories from French doctors, by pulling out statistics that showed that women, and particularly young women, were less likely to contract the virus than men and married women. Another key element that connects 1918 and 2020 is the importance of at-home fashion for those limited in their movements by the pandemic, which was noted both in the consumer fashion press and in the trade papers. In October 1918, Women's Wear Daily reported on the growing demand for negligees and sweaters due to the influenza. This trend was also seen in Vogue in January 1921, as the magazine instructed their readership in how to have, quote, exquisite grace in the hours of convalescence by the fireside. That is the image you can see here on the left, where you can see that she has exquisite grace. This image is a striking resemblance to an image that appeared on Vogue.com just last month, pointing to the benefits of a fashionable yet comfortable at-home wardrobe. This image features Ashley Merrill, the founder of loungewear brand Lunya, and she touts the benefits of an at-home wardrobe, predicting that, quote, over the long term, our home will become much more the center of our world because we have all of these new options opened up for us. The connectivity of the internet and the potential for working from home gives a very different context to contemporary loungewear, but similarity in the ideals of at-home style are remarkable. Fashion magazines did not entirely ignore the more serious side of the pandemic. Harper's Bazaar, as well as lifestyle magazines such as the Ladies' Home Journal, highlighted ways in which women could use nursing skills learned in the war or volunteer in their communities. Notably, however, I found no articles in these magazines that dealt with any kind of emotional or personal loss potentially suffered by either readers or contributors, projecting the image of a readership only involved in the disease as far as they could contribute charitably or wear appropriate furs or negligees to either heal or ward off illness. That is not to say necessarily this is a failing on their part. The magazines appear to offer more of a means of escape than serving as an emotional salve. This means of escape or fantasy is manifest in another element that appears in fashion magazines of the period, the pandemic as a source of creative inspiration for designers. In January 1919, Harper's Bazaar featured the work of milliner Tapé, who said that the Spanish inspiration for his hats came from the Spanish flu. A few years later, Vogue recalled the influenza, called here the grippe, as a reason for Poiret's liberal use of fur on a coat worn by his wife Denise, explaining, quote, even infirmities may serve the mode. Thus, Madame Paul Poiret found in the grippe the occasion for wearing the furs of the autumn mode, choosing otter on a rust-colored popeline wrap. Both examples suggest that the fashion magazine was quickly able to transform even the most macabre world events into fashionable dress. Although we are presently still in a time of crisis in which there are questions being raised about the future of the fashion industry more generally, this transformation of tragedy into creative source material suggests a way that fashion is likely to utilize the pandemic once the most difficult time has subsided. Although over a century separates us from the 1918 pandemic, looking through these magazines reveals striking similarities. I pulled out this quote because of the essential emotional core that connects us to the people of 1918 to 1920. Writing in Harper's Bazaar in 1919, Stuart Van Kampen says, all the homely needful things, so rare of late, have assumed a value out of all proportion to their actual worth. The preciousness of the ordinary is indeed particularly poignant when its precarity has been revealed. Although today, globalism and the immediacy of the internet have enabled fashion publications to respond in a somewhat more timely and relevant manner to the pandemic as it unfolds, in both 1918 and 2020, the fashion media tried to add a dose of normalcy and personal control to an otherwise abnormal and out of control time.
Thank you, Caroline, for the fantastic presentation, which actually took us back to 1918. Questions and comments So we have a few here. Hannah, I guess, yes, this is, yeah, in reference with your talk, Caroline. Yeah.
Do I think the pace
Yeah.
of the pandemic? I think that it's true that the pace has some aspects to it. However, you see mentions of the pandemic as early as 1918 in the magazines. They're extremely minor, so but it is known about. It's not. I feel like now there was a bit of a delay because of all of this pre-shooting. I don't think these magazines at the time had quite as much work in advance that was going on. So even though of course there's delays in how, you know, mail is being transmitted and all of that, they were aware of the pandemic early on, even though they chose not to focus on
it. Okay. Questions, comments. Let's see if there are any hands raised. Well, so we are getting closer to the final of our marathon, so probably people are a bit tired, but still. So, okay. Seems like, yes, there might be some comments later in this yes, chat box. And those of you who have already presented, please just check this section, because there are quite a lot of comments, and I think, yeah, quite a lot of them refer to, yeah, to your papers. And yes, Han Ro, thanks you for the paper, Caroline, and yeah, Heike Jens also thanks you for the presentation.